Over to Unit 3 in Week 5's module, we're going to be covering the must-knows before selling and getting it done right. Now we're on to the section where we'll be talking about the pitfalls to avoid and fully understand the must-knows before it comes time to actually selling. So what you want to be doing is you want to think in the eyes of the purchaser, and you want to figure out, have you actually answered all their questions? What about their finance? You don't want to leave it to chance, because you only need one buyer for it to be a success and for you to realize the profits on the other end. So for myself, I've actually provided you guys a kind of checklist of everything I go through to understand and things we must answer before we actually put the property on the open market. And it's something that I call basically the home information pack. And that clarifies everything I need to be providing before I actually list the property, because I know that if I don't cover everything in the hit pack, the questions are going to come flying in, and it's actually going to involve more time and effort for me to answer those questions and be more of a hassle when my time can be better spent elsewhere looking for the next deal. So the checklist is very actually straightforward, and the checklist of the things we must include when it comes time to actually selling a property is to actually provide the LIM. You want to have the LIM in place, and this doesn't cost a lot of money, so you might as well get it and prepare it for the purchaser, because they're going to be wanting to get it on their own anyway, and should they have to actually pay for it themselves, it's going to detract from them wanting to put an offer on your property versus a property that already has a LIM provided. You also want a rental appraisal, and this not only helps your case when it comes time to selling to a buyer, but should you need a JV money partner, these are the informations you're going to have to provide to your JV money partner anyway. So you're killing two birds with one stone here. And you also want to have a valuation. A registered valuation would work even better, because it allows the purchaser to actually use your registered valuation to go out and obtain finance. Now, it's not always the case that the banks that the purchaser is working with will actually happily use your valuation, and they may say that we want to go out and get their own valuation. And if that's the case, let the buyer go out and do that, because you don't want to prevent them from going out and getting their own valuation. They will need it to actually go out and get a bank loan from the banks to buy your property. You also want to have a meth test done. Now, in this day and age, people are so worried about drug contamination and meth contamination that it's always on their mind. And, you know, certain countries like, I believe Australia is actually compulsory. Anytime a tenant moves in or out of property, a meth test actually has to be done to ensure that there is a level of safety in the property before another tenant comes in and lives in the property. So just to make things easier, you want to provide a meth test, and often I don't buy any properties that are contaminated with meth anyway. So you want to ensure that the buyers or whoever's looking at the property knows that. They want to, you want to highlight all the good points about your property, that, you know, you've already got a valuation, you've already got a rental appraisal, so if you want to go out and rent it, this is how much you're going to get, and the LIM, you know, everything checks out on the LIM, so here you go. And you even want to have the meth test done to actually show them that, you know, I've taken the liberty and taken the proactive approach of going out and getting the testing done, so that you can move in straight in the property without any stress, without any worry if there is any contamination or not. So it's a very basic checklist, but these are the things that you want to have, because if you don't have this, the buyers are going to be coming back and asking you and bugging you about this information anyway. So, you know, to save your time and save everyone else's time and make things easier, have all of this, have this checklist, and you know, I'll be providing you with a checklist on everything to make your marketing plan a strong plan that can actually get you a sale for the price that you're after for the property that you're selling. So on the screen right now, guys, you'll just see a few pointers here that I've put down when it comes time to selling and the must-knows before you actually sell. So you want to have all bases actually covered, and that actually reduces the chance of a renegotiation from your purchaser. Very similar to the case of when I'm going out and renegotiating with a vendor for a cheaper price. The same idea can happen when it comes time to selling a property. The buyers can actually try to renegotiate with you and use the conditional period as leverage, just as I mentioned that this is a technique I also use as well. Minor imperfections can also be used as leverage, and I've actually had experience with this on a property we were selling where, you know, it was pretty much 95% immaculate. There wasn't anything you could find wrong. However, there was a very small old leak in the hot water cylinder that actually affected the flooring around it and made it a bit soft, and that needed to be replaced. And it was a very kind of minor details which only would have cost less than $500 to fix. However, I realized that the purchaser had noticed the imperfection in the property, and they basically used it as leverage and said, look, the property is not perfect, that's why you need to drop the price. I know that the original price we put down in the contract was this much, but you need to give us 10 grand off because of this issue. And that's what people will be doing. They're going to be pushing for a big discount just for a very small problem. And that leads me to my next point. You actually want to preempt these imperfections as part of your price so they can't actually leverage that. So rather than having the buyer say, look, there's a bit of rot around the hot water cylinder, I need 10 grand off, or can we renegotiate the price for another 5 grand, knowingly that it's only going to cost $500 to fix, I can actually preempt those imperfections very early on while he's actually preparing to write me an offer. So I can say, look, you can see the house is pretty much immaculate. It's it's almost 100% all there, and the reason why I say it's almost 100% there is because I do want to highlight this small little rotting area by the hot water cylinder, off which we've already got a quote to fix that's going to cost $500. And you can, by doing this, you've already gonna given him the idea that, okay, well, it's only going to cost $500 to fix, so he already knows, or the buyer already knows, that he's not going to be able to negotiate or try use that as leverage to push the price too much further down. And you might even say that's why, that because of this imperfection, this is why our property is priced at this level. So that shows that you're very confident in your pricing, and you've actually systematically worked out the pricing and even factored in all the negatives about the property as well. So you definitely want to be doing this, and a quicker sale means less holding period and allows you to work on the next deal. So having all of these bases covered means that you will get to the end of your sale and receive the money a lot quicker, rather than holding it up and going back and forth in terms of negotiation, or even worse, if the buyer's trying to leverage an extra 5 grand discount because of a small rot by the hot water cylinder. They may not be prepared to work with you unless you go out and fix that. And that's all good and well that you don't have to decrease the price by an extra 5 grand, but the fact that you have to go out and still spend time, resource, and money to go out and fix this problem, even though it's only going to cost you $500, it's still time and effort that's wasted and spent on the same property. Whereas if you've preempted it and made it part of the price, that's something you can avoid altogether. So keep this in mind, and the main idea is that you want to have everything in place so you can get to the final sale and receive and realize the profits a lot faster, so you can go on and continue to work on the next deal. So the next topic we're going to be talking about in this week's lesson is how to actually construct the perfect marketing ad, or what constitutes a perfect marketing ad. And essentially, your ad must answer all the questions the buyer has. And it's the same in any instance when you're marketing to an investor or you're marketing to a first home buyer. There's certain questions that the buyers will be having in their head, and it's best to actually think in their shoes and figure out what they would like to know ahead of time, so this actually doesn't come up in any delays or back and forth conversations that's going to take more time and more research on your part. So let's go over what these things are. So there's a checklist that I actually follow when it comes time to writing an ad, so I ensure I don't miss out any of the important points that I know the purchasers are going to be asking me about. And the first thing is highlighting all the local amenities. And the amenities actually include any grocery centers, supermarkets, or kind of malls and cafes or restaurants of that nature, or any local community kind of facilities like a swimming pool or a park or anything like that. You want to highlight that because people want to find out if they can actually thrive and have a good lifestyle by living in the property that you're selling. You also want to highlight distance away from the local schools, and highlight what schools the property is in zone for. That's very important to figure out where their kids are going to go, should there be any kids potentially living in the property. Also very important is to highlight the distance from local transport, and you want to both include the railway lines as well as bus stops. Specifications of properties is also very important. I realized this, when I first kind of got started into property trading, I ran into a lot of different buyers that only said they only purchase brick and tile, or I only ran into people that said I only buy villas, or I only buy weatherboard homes. And it's very strange to think that certain buyers out there only limit only limit themselves to certain types of cladding, but it is very real. So you want to specify the property details, not just cladding alone. You may want to say whether it's a freehold property or whether it's a cross lease, and this helps avoid dealing with kind of time wasters that don't know what specifications of the property is, only for you to tell them that, oh, it's actually hardy plank or fiberlight cement, and they turn around and say, oh, well, that's something I don't buy. So that's another reason why you want to be highlighting the specs of the property. And the last thing is you want to be providing an asking price, or even if you're doing negotiation, at least have a price range. I find that helps with the sale a lot quicker rather than having a negotiation with no price whatsoever, because if I was thinking in terms of the buyer, why would I waste my time inquiring about a property if I have no idea whether I'm going to be able to afford it or not, because there's no indication. So if you are going down the negotiation route, I do recommend you to actually have a price range that you're actually looking for. And don't worry if the starting price range is a little low. It just helps the buyers to put something on paper, and you can always negotiate for a higher price. So that's just a very basic checklist of things that I follow when it comes time to writing the perfect marketing ad to go out on TradeMe or realestate.co.nz. And again, I will provide this checklist for you guys on this week's material, so you can actually download it and print it out, so that when you are running your own ad for a private sale, when it comes time to sell your property, you can actually follow the same things that I've got and ensure that you get to a quicker sale, and also ensuring you a price that works for you as well. What I want to do for you guys now is actually show you an example of what the perfect marketing ad looks like. So this is an example of what the perfect marketing ad looks like, and it basically entails all the things that we've covered in our checklist. And don't worry guys if you can't see this in full screen or very clearly, because I will be providing this in a high resolution image where you can actually read it word for word on this week's downloadable section on this week's materials as well. But just to go over what I've actually highlighted in the red are the same things that I've just talked about, which, you know, entails the asking price, entails the specifications of the properties, it entails the local amenities in the area. It also gives you the distance away from the local schools and the local transport. And I've even provided the terms of sale as well, because sometimes that helps in terms of receiving a faster sale. And I might openly put that I expect the settlement date to be on 30th of August, or I might put down that the deposit that I need isn't going to be the standard 10% or 5% required when you're buying a property through a real estate agent. And I might actually put down as almost as a benefit to the purchaser that the deposit is only going to be $15,000 or it's only $20,000. And when the purchasers see things like that, in their mind, they're going, well, this is very different to all the other properties I've been looking at. And I mean, the price works for me, the budget works for me, but what might actually capture their attention is that they may not actually have a lot of access to a big deposit. So your property might be fitting in that scenario, because you can actually provide more leeway in terms of what they have to put down for an actual deposit amount. And that's the benefits of kind of selling it privately yourself, because you can change all of these terms and conditions, and sometimes it actually favors the buyer a lot more by doing it this way, and that may just be the buyer that you're looking for to get the sale across the line. Now, when it comes time to actually receiving offers for the property that you're trying to offload and sell, I just want to point out something that's very important that you guys will come across when it does come time to selling. So I don't want you guys to get kind of trapped like I have in the past, because I didn't initially know this. So on the conditions of the sales and purchase agreement, if someone actually circles yes to a limb being a condition, even though any property that I'm selling, I'll always get the limb and I'll provide it to the purchasers. So you want to ensure that they actually cross out yes and leave it as a no. The reason for it is because if they've actually circled yes, even though you have the limb in place, there's no reason for them to circle yes for the limb. It actually means that they've got 15 working days to review the limb before going unconditional. And the lawyers can advise your purchasers this time frame, and it could be the case that your buyers try to hold you up for that whole period so that you can't actually take on any offers. And this is what happened to me on one of the properties where I wasn't aware of this, and although the purchaser said yes, they require a limb, and they realized I had already provided them a limb, I didn't think too much of it, and I didn't think it would affect the time frame or the conditional period at all. But I was badly mistaken, and that purchaser actually tied me up for the next 15 days because the lawyer advised them that they had 15 days and that they could actually take their time before going unconditional. So that's the worst thing that can happen as a seller, because that means I'm stuck with this buyer that may seem committed, but also it gives them a chance to pull out during that 15 days. Now, I've been advised from my lawyer that if the limb is actually in good condition, meaning there's nothing unconsented or there's no outstanding issues, there's no reason why they can actually say, no, I don't want to go ahead because of the limb. So there's still a very good chance, it's extremely high chance your buyer will be fulfilling right to the end if they have selected yes for the limb as the only condition, because if the limb is in a good state, meaning that there's no outstanding CCC issues, the buyer or the purchaser will still have to go unconditional. But I did want to point that out to you guys, because if you are providing a limb, which you always should, because the purchasers will always need the limbs and the lawyers will always need to review the limbs anyway, you want to be highlighting no, and you want to be providing them the limb physically or to their emails to avoid this problem. So there are a few more things that I just want to cover in regards to the limb condition that that you want to be aware of when it comes time to actually offloading a property, and should a person actually circle yes for a limb, what actually happens during that 15 working day process. So if during the working day process of the 15 working days, there's no kind of issues disputed by the purchaser, what actually happens is the conditional period of that limb would automatically go unconditional. So you still don't have to worry too much, in a sense that the buyer won't be messing you around, and if there's nothing that stands out significantly, they wouldn't actually be able to dispute the limb at all. Now, there are a couple of things that you want to do to avoid the whole issue with the limb, and instead of getting your buyer to write yes on a limb condition, what you'd actually go back with is counter that proposal and cross that out and actually say, well, do you actually want to provide a due diligence period instead? Now, the reason why you want to do that is the due diligence period is a period that you can normally set yourself, and again, it's normally within that kind of 10 to 15 working days. Now, that's only the case when I'm going out and buying a property. However, when I'm wanting to sell a property, I want the purchaser to have as little time as possible before they actually call the agreement unconditional. So rather than putting kind of 10 to 15 working days for the due diligence, I would suggest, can you put down 5 working days, or can you put down maybe 3 working days for the due diligence? And I would actually counter this back and write in the clause myself, initial next to it, in the hopes that the purchaser can also initial and roll with the changes that I've actually proposed. So that's one way that you can override the limb issue, by crossing that out altogether and selecting no for it, and having a due diligence instead if the buyer really wants some time to vet the property and do some research on the property. Now, on that note, in regards to the due diligence clause, I would actually tweak it to the following on what you can see on the screen. Instead of having the original clause, which is the vendor allows the purchaser 10 working days for due diligence to their discretionary satisfaction, what you would actually remove is that last portion of the sentence where I say to their discretionary satisfaction. So if you actually take that part out, basically what the lawyers will help you do is go out and talk to the potential purchaser, or the purchaser's lawyers will communicate to the purchaser and go back and say, well, why did you not want to go ahead with the property? Should there be any reason for the vendors to not move forward with the sale? And if you actually have the last part of the sentence saying to their discretionary satisfaction, that means the purchaser doesn't have to tell you a reason why they don't want to go ahead. And we want to limit that ability for them to pull out of the sale. So we want to say, well, tell me your reasoning why on the reason why you don't want to go ahead anymore. And if they actually can't provide a reason that falls within the due diligence, kind of due diligence category, meaning that the property is all in check, there's no meth, the building report is fine, and everything essentially with the property is a-okay, and the limb checks out fine as well, then there's no reason for them to actually pull out other than a change of mind. Now, the lawyers will actually try help fight in this case to get the buyers to actually go unconditional, because there is some commitment that they've put forward, and there's a high chance they can actually commit to the very end. So having this clause there without the discretionary satisfaction portion of it generally puts a little bit more pressure on the buyer, because the lawyers will actually go back to the vendor and say, well, you have to come up with reasonings on why you want to pull out. Now, in the instance that the buyer has no reason for pulling out and they just want to kind of cancel the contract and walk away from it, unfortunately, there's still nothing too much you can do, and it's not really worth your time to pursue any legal avenues to try get the buyer to actually commit to the purchase of the property. There are certain things you can actually do to help you kind of not be committed to just one buyer, even if they do have a period of time in regards to the due diligence. And you definitely don't want the due diligence period to actually hold you up should another buyer come along and potentially put an offer on your property. So you still want to actually have the ability to look at other offers, and maybe it's the case that you give your current purchaser a deadline should another offer come in, that you give them a deadline of maybe 24 hours or 48 hours to say, you have this period to go unconditional now because I've already got another offer, and if you don't want to go ahead with it in the next 24 hours or 48 hours, however you've set this out with the vendor, your contract would actually expire and it's no longer valid, and I'm going to be accepting another offer. And this is basically called a sunset clause. So I'll show you guys what a sunset clause is now. So on the screen here, guys, you'll see that I've actually inputted a sunset clause, and you'll see that it's all crossed out in terms of the condition just to make things easier. And basically the sunset clause is a clause that actually helps the seller, the vendor, which is yourself in this situation. And it basically states that if an unconditional offer is presented to the vendor has the option to give the buyer 48 hours notice to go unconditional, otherwise the contract is deemed as void. Now, the other offer doesn't actually have to be unconditional. That's just what I've written in this instance, and it can actually state that if another offer is presented to the vendor has the option to give the current buyer and the current contract in place a 48 hours notice period to actually go unconditional, otherwise the current contract will be voided if that purchaser chooses not to call the contract unconditional within that 48-hour time slot. And that basically gives you leverage against the current buyer to say, well, you better call it unconditional if you're seriously wanting to buy the property, because this clause in the agreement lets me basically give you that 48 hours as a final chance or final warning to go ahead and purchase the property. Otherwise, I'm going to cancel that agreement, and I have the ability to do so because of this clause. And the reason for that is because I have another contract as a backup ready to go, and other interested people that actually want to buy the property. So anytime you're looking at selling a property, I always put in the sunset clause, because this gives me more power against the current buyer, gets them to kind of scurry up a little faster and make a decision whether they actually want to go ahead or not. But it also means that I'm not going to miss out the chance should another offer come in, and I can still keep in contact with that new purchaser and let them know that I'll come back with a final answer within 2 days, within that 48-hour period. So it just gives you more leverage in terms of working with more options, and it also puts a bit of pressure on the actual buyer themselves. So keep in mind, use the sunset clause every single time when it comes to selling a property. Just to cover a little bit more in regards to the limb condition, if it's the case that the buyer is adamant and they do want to put in yes for the limb, what you can actually do is go on to clause number 9 as part of the sales and purchase agreement, and I believe it's 9.2.2. You can actually see that I've circled out in red, highlighting that it states 15 working days as part of the conditional period when checking out the limb. And you guys can actually change this to however many days you want. And you can see, as an example, I've put down 7th day, so it's only a 7 working conditional period to allow the purchaser to do their due diligence on the limb. But equally, if I make these changes, I would have to get the initial purchaser to initial as well as myself being the vendor to also initial next to these changes. So that's very important, and that basically helps you mitigate the issue of having the standard default, which is 15 working days when it comes to the LIM, if the buyer or the purchaser is very adamant that they still want to circle yes when it comes to the LIM section. And just also to note, guys, that if the LIM is basically not changed in terms of leaving it as a standard default of 15 days, basically what happens is if you also have a due diligence clause in there, for example, allowing you to do due diligence of 10 working days, well, guess what? The limit clause will actually override the due diligence period, and after the due diligence period expired, which is 10 days, the purchaser still has that extra 5 days, which is the total 15 working days for the lim clause, to actually go out and do their due diligence before calling it unconditional. And that's very important to note, because if it's going to drag out and take more working days before the purchaser can actually go unconditional, that's going to drag out the time and the period for yourself to actually go out and receive the money. And it's going to tie things up if you've got other deals on the go as well. So keep that in mind. I encourage having no selected on the lim altogether, but if the buyer or purchaser is adamant, you can change the default date, and that's by going on clause 9 and making the amendments as you can see on the current screen here. And again, guys, if you actually provide the sunset clause again, it does help you with a bit of leverage to put pressure on the purchaser to actually make a decision very quickly, even though they do have the 15 working days period to go out and do due diligence on the actual lim. That is, of course, only valid if you do have another offer in place that you can put pressure on to the actual buyer. If you don't have another offer in place, it may be the case that you can't say that I'm going to call this void because you don't have anything in place anyway, and it's best to let your buyer complete their due diligence and come back with a final answer. Another very important default clause or default conditional period that I want to talk to you guys about is the actual title, and it does affect us when it comes time to actually offloading the deal and selling it. And you can actually find this section on clause 5 of the sales and purchase agreement, more specifically 5.2 clause A, which actually highlights the 10th working day after the date of the agreement in terms of the title. So what does this mean? And basically, even if the buyer goes unconditional, the buyer still has a 10 working day period from the date of the sales and purchase agreement to request for the vendor to remove any encumbrances or restrictions that make the title different from what was originally agreed upon when executing the sales and purchase contract. So not as big of an issue as the lim, but it's basically ensuring that the title is of sound nature and it doesn't have any things like a caveat or anything lodged against that particular property that's going to cause any issues moving forward for the new purchaser. Now, requisitions must relate to a defect in the title that can include things such as easements, restrictive covenants, fencing covenants, where the title is materially different from the title that the purchaser has contracted to buy. But otherwise, guys, if no restrictions are made to the vendor, then the purchaser is deemed to have accepted the title and the contract is now fully unconditional. Now, to put us in a better position and to avoid such hassles of the 10 working day delay, and personally, I've never actually had a buyer come back to me after they've gone unconditional to come back and say there's something wrong with the title. But just in best practice, what you want to do is you want to reduce that 10th working day to a time frame as low as possible. Now, for investors, if you're working with investors, they can check titles very quickly and get their lawyers to check very quickly. So you might want to reduce it as low as 1 working day. However, when you're selling to first home buyers, it's good practice just to give them a little bit more time than if you were to sell to investors, because they are new to the space. So you may want to change this to 3 to 5 working days, which should be sufficient. And again, if you are changing anything off the original default set out in the original sales and purchase agreement, when you cross things out and introduce a new time frame, for example, from 10 days to 3 days, you want to be getting it initialed from the purchaser as well as yourself. Because if these changes get picked up by a lawyer and they haven't been actually initialed, the contract may not actually be able to fulfill right to the end, or even considered as a binding contract because you've made changes without the right initials. Or it may be the case that the default will still be in place. So that's another thing just to keep in mind, is if you are thinking that there may be possible title issues, you want to resolve them well before you actually sell the property anyway. And even so, if a buyer goes unconditional, you want to reduce that period from 10 working days to 1 working days when you're working with investors, or 3 working days when you're working with first home buyers. So guys, we've reached the end of week 5's session, where we've gone over how to offload the deal and basically maximize your profits so no money is going to be left on the table. And I thank you guys so much for joining me right to the end, and we've covered so much information, so much content. And it's now time for the actionable steps and how you guys can actually go out and apply this to understand it better and actually go out and get the experience. So what I want you guys to do for this actionable step is very simple. I want you guys to write up 2 ad copies for 2 properties that you actually have under contract, just so that you get a better feel of how to create the perfect clean marketing ad, as well as how you would propose it to investors or to your own database. So I want you guys to write 2 ad copies for 2 properties that you currently have under contract, and as well as that, I want you to complete the quiz. And again guys, as always, make sure you get 100% scoring before you actually move on to week 6. As always, if you don't complete everything or don't understand everything in this week, go back and rewind the video to the sections that are a little bit confusing and rewatch it until it makes sense to you. And if you do have any questions, again, make sure you go onto the Facebook page and ask those questions, and you will get the support to answer those questions that you currently have. So again guys, thank you so much for joining me on week 5, and go out, apply the actionable steps, and I'll see you guys on week 6. Thank you everyone, and bye bye for now.